You won't believe what happened to me, so please like and subscribe. Let me know in the comments what country you're watching from. My name is Margaret White. I'm 46 years old, and what I'm about to tell you will make you question every rideshare trip you've ever taken. It started on a Tuesday morning in October. The autumn air carried that crisp bite that makes you pull your cardigan tighter, and the maple trees lining our suburban street had turned brilliant shades of amber and rust. I was running late for my dental appointment downtown, fumbling with my phone as I ordered an Uber from our front porch. The familiar blue sedan pulled up within minutes, and I barely glanced at the driver as I slid into the back seat, muttering a quick hello while checking my appointment confirmation. The driver was a man in his early 30s with sandy brown hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He introduced himself as Derek Morrison, his voice soft and oddly familiar, in a way that made me look up from my phone. Something about his eyes in the rearview mirror gave me pause, but I dismissed the feeling as we pulled away from my house on Elm Street. During the 20-minute ride, Derek made casual conversation that seemed innocent enough. He mentioned how nice our neighborhood looked, asked if I'd lived there long, and commented on the beautiful rose bushes in our front yard. I found myself sharing more than I usually would with the driver, mentioning that my husband Paul had planted those roses when we first moved in 15 years ago, and how our daughter Emma always helped me tend them when she was younger. It wasn't until I was walking out of the dental office 3 hours later that the first red flag appeared. As I waited for my return ride, Derek's blue sedan pulled up again. The Uber app had assigned me a different driver entirely, a woman named Lisa, but there was Derek, rolling down his window with that same soft smile. "Coincidence?" he said, his voice carrying an undertone I couldn't quite place. "I was in the area and saw you waiting. The other driver canceled, so I picked up your ride request." The explanation seemed reasonable, but something cold settled in my stomach as I got into his car. During the ride home, Derek's questions became more specific. He asked about Paul's work schedule, mentioned seeing Emma's college stickers on our mailbox, and somehow knew that I usually grocery shopped on Thursday mornings at the Whole Foods on Market Street. When we pulled into my driveway, I noticed Derek's eyes scanning our house with an intensity that made my skin crawl. He lingered as I gathered my purse, and I caught him taking what looked like a photo of our address numbers with his phone. That evening, I found Paul in our kitchen, steam rising from his coffee mug as he scrolled through work emails on his laptop. The warm yellow light from our pendant lamps cast familiar shadows across the granite countertops, but the comfort I usually felt in this space was replaced by an unsettling anxiety. "Paul," I said, setting my keys on the counter with a clink that seemed too loud in the quiet room. "Something strange happened with my Uber driver today?" My husband looked up, his kind brown eyes immediately focusing on my face with the attention that had made me fall in love with him 22 years ago. Paul White had always been my anchor, the steady presence who listened without judgment and helped me sort through my worries with practical wisdom. I told him about Derek, about the coincidental second ride, the specific questions, and the way he'd studied our house. As I spoke, Paul's expression grew more serious, his fingers drumming against his coffee mug in the rhythm that meant he was processing something important. "That does sound odd," he said finally. "Maybe you should use a different ride service for a while, just to be safe." I agreed, but over the next few weeks, Derek seemed to appear everywhere. I spotted his blue sedan parked across from Emma's apartment building when I visited our 24-year-old daughter for lunch. He was behind me in line at the Starbucks where I met my best friend Rachel every Friday morning. Each time, he offered that same soft smile and acted surprised to see me, but the coincidences were piling up like autumn leaves. Emma noticed my distraction during one of our weekly coffee dates. My daughter had inherited Paul's observant nature and my stubborn streak, making her impossible to fool when something was bothering me. She sat across from me in the cozy corner booth of our favorite cafe, her dark hair catching the afternoon sunlight streaming through the large windows, and fixed me with the same determined look she'd worn as a child when she knew I was hiding something. "Mom, you've been jumpy for weeks," Emma said, wrapping her hands around her vanilla latte. "You keep looking over your shoulder, and yesterday, when we were walking to your car, you practically dragged me around the block to avoid that blue sedan." I hadn't realized she'd noticed, but Emma had always been perceptive. As Paul's daughter and my confidant, she'd grown into a young woman who combined his steady logic with my intuitive nature. I found myself telling her about Derek, watching her expression shift from concern to alarm as the details accumulated. "Mom, this isn't normal behavior," she said firmly. "You need to document everything and maybe talk to someone about this." The breaking point came 3 weeks later, when I was having my regular Friday coffee with Rachel Chen, my closest friend since our kids were in elementary school together. Rachel worked as a paralegal downtown and had developed a sharp eye for details and an even sharper instinct for trouble. We'd been friends for over 15 years, bonding initially over school fundraisers and soccer car pools. But our friendship had deepened into the kind of trust where we could share our deepest fears without judgment. We were sitting at our usual table by the window, the morning light illuminating the steam rising from our cups, when Rachel suddenly went very still. Her dark eyes fixed on something outside, and her normally animated expression became guarded. "Margaret," she said quietly, not looking away from the window. "Don't turn around, but there's a man in a blue car across the street. He's been watching us for the past 10 minutes, and he has a camera." My blood turned to ice. I knew without looking that it was Derek. Rachel, with her legal background and protective instincts, immediately took charge. She discreetly took photos of Derek's car and license plate with her phone, then suggested we leave through the back exit. As we gathered our things, she explained that she'd noticed the same car following us during our last 2 coffee dates, but hadn't wanted to alarm me until she was certain. That night, I sat in our living room with Paul and Emma, the 3 of us huddled together on our worn leather sectional like we were planning a defense strategy. The familiar comfort of our home, with its family photos covering the mantelpiece and Emma's childhood artwork still hanging in the hallway, felt violated by the knowledge that Derek had been watching us, learning our routines, inserting himself into our lives. Paul had printed out all the photos Rachel had taken, and we spread them across our coffee table, like evidence in a crime drama. Emma had created a timeline of my encounters with Derek, her neat handwriting filling 3 pages of a legal pad. The pattern was undeniable and terrifying. "This has been going on for 2 months," Emma said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "He's not just your Uber driver, Mom. He's been systematically stalking you." Paul reached over and took my hand, his familiar warmth grounding me as the full scope of Derek's behavior became clear. But what I discovered next was a small detail that blew the whole thing open. That evening, as we sat surrounded by the evidence of Derek's stalking, I made a decision that would reveal just how deep this went. I pulled out my phone and opened the Uber app, scrolling through my ride history with shaking fingers. "What are you doing, Mom?" Emma asked, leaning closer to see my screen. "I'm checking something," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Rachel, you said you noticed that blue car during our last 2 coffee dates. But I need to see exactly when Derek started driving me." Paul moved to sit beside me on the couch, his shoulder pressed against mine as I scrolled through weeks of ride records. The familiar names of various drivers filled the screen until I reached early September. That's when I saw it. "Oh my God," I breathed. Derek's name appeared for the first time on September 8th, a Tuesday morning ride to my dentist appointment. But as I kept scrolling backward, checking the dates more carefully, a horrifying pattern emerged. "He's been my driver for almost every single ride for the past 2 months," I said, my voice rising with panic. "Look at this. September 8th, Derek. September 12th, Derek. September 15th, Derek. Every grocery store trip, every coffee date with Rachel, every time I've needed a ride to the train station." Emma grabbed the phone from my hands, her journalism instincts kicking in as she studied the data. "Mom, this isn't possible. Uber's algorithm doesn't work this way. You should be getting different drivers based on proximity and availability. The chances of getting the same driver this consistently are practically zero." Paul ran his hands through his graying hair, a gesture I recognized from his most stressful workdays. "There has to be an explanation. Maybe he's gaming the system somehow, or maybe he's the only driver in our area most of the time." But Rachel, ever the paralegal, was already connecting dots that made my stomach turn. "Margaret, think about what this means. He would have had to know your schedule in advance to make sure he was available for your rides. He would have had to be tracking your patterns, maybe even following you to learn your routines before he ever became your driver." The weight of her words settled over our living room like a suffocating blanket. The family photos on our mantelpiece, Emma's old soccer trophies on the bookshelf, the comfortable chaos of our daily life. Everything felt tainted by the realization that Derek had been orchestrating our encounters from the very beginning. "I need to see something," I said, opening my calendar app. "Rachel, when did you first notice his car following us?" Rachel pulled out her own phone, checking her calendar. 3 weeks ago, during our coffee date on October 18th. But I thought I might have seen the same blue car the week before that, on October 11th. I cross-referenced the dates with my Uber history, and the pattern became even more sinister. Derek had driven me to meet Rachel on both of those days, which meant he knew exactly where I'd be and when. Emma was quiet for a long moment, studying the timeline she'd created earlier. When she finally looked up, her face was pale. "Mom, I think he's been following you even when you're not using Uber. Think about it. How else would he know to be available for all these rides?" "He'd have to know your schedule better than you do." Paul stood up abruptly and walked to our front window, peering through the blinds at our quiet residential street. "Is he out there now?" he asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. "I don't know," I admitted, joining him at the window. Our neighborhood looked peaceful in the evening light, with porch lights beginning to flicker on and the familiar sight of neighbors walking their dogs. But now every parked car looked suspicious. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Rachel had been unusually quiet, and when I turned back to the couch, I found her staring at something on her phone with an expression that made my blood run cold. "Margaret," she said slowly, "I need to tell you something, and I don't think you're going to like it." The tone of her voice made Emma and Paul both freeze. Rachel had been my anchor through this entire ordeal, the one person who'd taken my concerns seriously from the beginning. If she looked scared, we were all in trouble. "What is it?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. Rachel held up her phone, showing me a photo she'd taken earlier that day. It was the picture of Derek's blue car from outside the coffee shop, but she'd zoomed in on something I hadn't noticed before. "Look at the passenger seat," she said quietly. I squinted at the image, and my heart nearly stopped. There, clearly visible through the car window, was a manila folder, thick with papers. And attached to the outside of that folder was a photograph of me. The room fell completely silent. I stared at the photograph on Rachel's phone, my hands beginning to shake. The image of that manila folder with my picture attached to it felt like a physical blow. When did you take this? Paul asked, his voice barely above a whisper as he moved closer to look at the screen. This afternoon, when we were leaving the coffee shop, Rachel replied. I wanted to get his license plate number, but when I zoomed in later, I saw this. Emma sank back into the couch cushions, running her hands through her hair. Mom, this is way beyond just being a creepy Uber driver. He has files on you. I couldn't stop staring at the photo. Even though the image was grainy from being zoomed in, there was no mistaking what we were seeing. The folder was thick, suggesting it contained far more than just a single photograph. My mind raced with possibilities of what else might be in there, and none of them were good. We need to figure out how long this has been going on, I said, forcing myself to think practically despite the fear clawing at my chest. Rachel, can you send me that photo? I want to look at it more closely. Already done, she said, and my phone buzzed with the message. Paul began pacing the length of our living room, his footsteps heavy on the hardwood floor. I keep thinking about all the times you've mentioned your Uber driver being chatty. All those conversations where he seemed to know things about the neighborhood, about your routine. He was gathering information, Emma said flatly. Every single ride was like an interview, wasn't it, Mom? I thought back to all those seemingly innocent conversations. Derek asking about my favorite restaurants, commenting on the weather when I was dressed for specific activities, mentioning local events right before I'd tell him I was planning to attend them. At the time, it had felt like normal small talk. Now it felt like systematic data collection. I need to go through my Uber history more carefully, I said, opening the app again. Not just the dates, but the pickup and drop-off locations. If he's been stalking me, there might be a pattern I missed. Rachel moved to sit beside me on the couch. Let me help you with that. Sometimes a fresh pair of eyes can spot things you might overlook. As I scrolled through months of ride history, a new and terrifying thought occurred to me. What if he's been inside our house? The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Paul stopped pacing and turned to stare at me. What do you mean? Emma asked, though her expression suggested she already understood. Think about it, I continued, my voice getting stronger as the horrible possibility crystallized. He knows my schedule well enough to always be available when I need a ride. But what about the times when I'm not home? When you're at work, Paul, and Emma's at school? Rachel's face had gone pale. Margaret, have you noticed anything missing? Anything moved or out of place? I stood up and walked toward the kitchen, my family following behind me. Everything looked normal, but now I was seeing our home through different eyes. The spare key we kept under the decorative rock by the front door. The ground floor windows that we sometimes left unlocked during mild weather. The back gate that had a broken latch we'd been meaning to fix for months. I don't know, I admitted. I never had any reason to look for signs of someone being here. Emma went straight to the junk drawer in the kitchen and pulled out a small flashlight. I'm checking the doors and windows. If someone's been getting in, there might be scratches around the locks or something. Good thinking, Paul said. I'll check the back door and the basement windows. As my family spread out through the house, Rachel and I returned to examining my Uber history. The pattern that emerged was even more disturbing than I'd expected. Look at this, I said, pointing to a series of rides from 6 weeks ago. He picked me up from the grocery store on a Tuesday morning, then drove me home. But then, 3 hours later, I have another ride with him from home to the library. Rachel frowned at the timeline. That's not unusual by itself. But it is unusual that he was available both times with almost no wait, I explained. And look at this one from last month. He drove me to my doctor's appointment at 2 p.m., and somehow he was available to pick me up at exactly 3:15, right when I was walking out of the building. How would he know how long your appointment would take? Rachel asked. He wouldn't, I said grimly. Unless he was watching. Emma's voice called from the front hallway. Mom, you need to see this. Rachel and I hurried to where Emma was crouched by the front door, shining her flashlight on the lock mechanism. What is it? I asked. Emma pointed to tiny scratches around the keyhole that I'd never noticed before. They were fresh, the metal still bright where something had scraped against it. These aren't from normal key use, Emma said. It looks like someone's been picking the lock. Paul's footsteps echoed from the basement as he climbed back up the stairs. The basement window latch has been tampered with too, he announced, his voice tight with controlled anger. Someone definitely forced it open from the outside. I felt my knees go weak and had to lean against the doorframe. The reality of what we were discovering hit me like a physical blow. He's been inside our house, I whispered. Mom, sit down, Emma said, guiding me to the living room couch. We need to think this through logically. Rachel sat beside me, her expression grim but focused. Margaret, I need you to really think about this. Have you ever felt like someone was watching you when you weren't in an Uber? When you were at home or running errands? I closed my eyes, trying to remember. There have been times, I said slowly, when I've had this weird feeling that someone was behind me at the grocery store. And sometimes when I'm in the backyard, I get this creepy sensation like someone's looking at me from the woods behind our fence. Paul began pacing the living room, his hands clenched into fists. This is insane. How long has this been going on? And why didn't we notice anything? Because we weren't looking for it, Emma said matter-of-factly. Think about it, Dad. If someone's careful and only comes in when we're not home, how would we know? We don't have security cameras or an alarm system. Rachel pulled out her phone and opened my Uber history again. Let's cross-reference this with your family's schedules. Margaret, when do you usually take Uber rides? During the day, mostly, I replied, thinking back. When Paul's at work and Emma's at school? For grocery shopping, doctor appointments, meeting you for lunch? So Marcus knows when your house is likely to be empty? Rachel said, her voice getting more concerned. He knows Paul and Emma's schedules because he's heard you talking about them during rides. Emma suddenly jumped up from her chair. Oh my God, Mom! Remember last week when you couldn't find your spare house key? The one from under the rock? My blood ran cold. I thought I had just misplaced it somewhere in the house. What if he took it and made a copy? Emma asked. Then he could put it back later and you'd find it and think you just overlooked it. Paul stopped pacing and stared at us. Did you find it eventually? I nodded slowly. Yes, it turned up in my purse a few days later. I assumed I had picked it up and forgotten about it. This is getting worse by the minute, Rachel said, scrolling through more of my ride history. Look at this pattern from 2 months ago. You took 3 rides with Marcus in 1 week, and each time, he somehow knew exactly when to arrive. No waiting, no circling the block. That's not normal, Paul said. Even with the app's timing predictions, drivers usually have to wait or arrive a few minutes early. Emma was examining her phone now. I'm looking up information about rideshare drivers and background checks. Mom, did you ever feel unsafe during the actual rides? No, that's what makes this so disturbing, I admitted. He was always polite, professional. He remembered details about my life, asked about my family, seemed genuinely interested. I thought he was just being friendly. Rachel's expression darkened. He was gathering information. Every conversation was him learning more about your routine, your family, your life. The question is, what do we do now? Paul asked, finally sitting down across from us. We have scratches on locks and a suspicious pattern of rides, but do we have enough evidence to prove anything? Emma looked up from her phone. We need to be really careful about how we handle this. If Marcus realizes we're onto him, he might escalate his behavior. Escalate how? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Well, Emma said carefully, right now he seems to be content with watching and occasionally entering the house when no one's home. But if he feels threatened or thinks he's going to lose access to you, he might become more aggressive. Rachel nodded grimly. Emma's right. We need to document everything we can without alerting him to what we know. Paul leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. So, what's our first step? We can't just keep pretending everything is normal. Actually, that might be exactly what we have to do, at least temporarily, Rachel said. Margaret, I think you should take one more ride with Marcus, but this time I'll follow behind in my car. Absolutely not, Paul said immediately. I'm not letting Margaret get in a car with this guy again. But if we can catch him doing something obviously wrong, Emma interjected, like taking a route he shouldn't or driving past the house when he's supposed to be dropping Mom off, then we'd have real evidence. I felt torn between fear and the need to take action. What if he tries something during the ride? Rachel considered this. We could set up a system where you keep me on speakerphone the entire time, hidden in your purse. That way, if anything goes wrong, I'll hear it immediately. Paul shook his head vigorously. This sounds like a terrible plan. What if something happens that Rachel can't prevent just by following behind? Then what do you suggest? Emma asked her father. We change all our locks, stop using Uber, and hope he just goes away? Maybe that's exactly what we should do, Paul replied. Why take any risks? I looked around at my family and my best friend, all of them trying to protect me in their own way. But I realized that hiding wasn't going to solve this problem. No, I said firmly. If Marcus has been stalking me for months, simply avoiding him isn't going to make him stop. We need to find out exactly what he's been doing and get evidence that we can take to someone who can help us. Rachel squeezed my hand. Are you sure about this, Margaret? Before I could answer, we all heard it. The distinctive sound of a car pulling slowly into our driveway. Emma peered through the front window, and her face went white. Mom, she whispered. There's a car sitting in our driveway right now, and I think it's Marcus. My heart stopped completely. The sound of that engine idling in our driveway felt like a violation, like Marcus had crossed some invisible line between watching from a distance and actively invading our space. I could feel my pulse hammering in my throat as Emma's words sank in. Are you absolutely sure it's him? Paul whispered, moving toward the window but staying far enough back to avoid being seen. Emma nodded, her face still pressed against the edge of the curtain. Same car from the photos Rachel took. He's just sitting there with the engine running. Rachel stood up slowly, her expression shifting into something I'd never seen before. It wasn't fear exactly, but a kind of controlled alertness that made me realize she was taking this more seriously than she'd let on. How long has he been there? I don't know. We just heard him pull in. Emma's voice was barely audible. What do we do? The strangest thing was happening to me in that moment. Instead of the paralyzing fear I expected to feel, I was getting angry. Really angry. This man had been invading my privacy for months, going through my things, learning my routines, and now he had the audacity to sit in my driveway like he belonged there, like he had some right to be part of my life. I want to go out there, I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. Margaret, no. Paul's response was immediate and firm. We don't know what he wants or what he might do. But I was already thinking it through. He's been watching me for months without me knowing. Now I know. That changes everything. I'm not going to cower in my own house. Rachel caught my arm gently. I understand the impulse, but Paul's right. We don't know enough about his mental state or his intentions. Emma was still at the window, and I could see her shoulders tense. He's getting out of the car. That one small detail blew the whole thing open. The anger I'd been feeling shifted back into fear, but it was a different kind of fear now. It wasn't the abstract worry about what might happen. This was immediate and real. Marcus was in my driveway, and he was moving toward my house. Emma, get away from the window, Paul said urgently. Everyone moved to the back of the house. But I found myself frozen, staring toward the front door. I kept thinking about all those times he'd driven me places, making small talk about my day, asking about my family. Had he already known the answers to his questions? Had he been testing me somehow, comparing what I told him to what he'd observed? Margaret. Rachel's voice cut through my thoughts. We need to move away from the front of the house. I let her guide me toward the kitchen, Paul and Emma following close behind. My legs felt unsteady, and I realized I was shaking. The reality of the situation was hitting me in waves. This wasn't just about some creepy driver anymore. This was about a man who had been systematically invading my life, and now he was at my front door. We heard it then. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Emma grabbed my hand, and I could feel her trembling too. Paul positioned himself between us and the front of the house, though I wasn't sure what he planned to do if Marcus actually tried to get in. The knocking came again. Same rhythm, same deliberate pace. Should we call someone? Emma whispered. And tell them what? Rachel whispered back. That our Uber driver knocked on our door? She was right, and that made everything worse. Technically, Marcus wasn't doing anything illegal by knocking on my door, but we all knew this wasn't a normal visit. Normal people don't show up unannounced at their passengers' homes. I thought about all the evidence we'd gathered. The photos, the items that had been moved, the pattern of rides that didn't quite make sense. It painted a clear picture to us. But would it be enough to convince anyone else that this was serious? The knocking stopped, and the silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound had been. We waited, barely breathing, straining to hear any indication of what Marcus was doing. Maybe he left, Emma whispered after what felt like an eternity. Paul shook his head slightly, holding up a hand to keep us quiet. He was right to be cautious. We could still hear the car engine running in the driveway. I found myself thinking about all the conversations Marcus and I had shared during those rides. He'd seemed so normal, even friendly. He'd asked about Emma's job, remembered details about Paul's retirement. I'd thought he was just being polite, making conversation to pass the time during longer rides. Now I realized he'd been collecting information about my family, learning our schedules and routines. Every casual comment I'd made about our plans had been filed away somewhere in his mind. The worst part was how violated I felt. Not just because he'd been in my house, but because he'd made me complicit in my own stalking. I'd been the one telling him where we were going and when, never realizing he was using that information to build a map of my life. I can hear footsteps, Paul whispered. We all froze again, listening. The sound was faint but distinct. Marcus was walking around the outside of our house. The footsteps moved slowly along the side of the house, pausing at what I knew were the windows. My stomach churned as I imagined Marcus peering through the glass, trying to see inside. We had curtains drawn, but there were still gaps where light escaped, places where someone determined enough could catch glimpses of our lives. "He's checking the windows," Paul whispered, his voice tight with controlled anger. Emma squeezed my hand harder. I could see her jaw clenched, that same expression she got when she was trying to solve a particularly difficult problem at work. But this wasn't something that could be fixed with spreadsheets and logical analysis. The footsteps continued around the back of the house. I thought about our sliding patio door, the spare key we used to keep under the flower pot before Paul convinced us it wasn't safe. Thank goodness we'd listened to him about that. "This is insane," Rachel whispered. "He's literally circling our house like some kind of predator." She was right, and hearing her say it out loud made the situation feel even more surreal. An hour ago, I'd been worried about a few missing items and some uncomfortable rides. Now we were hiding in our own living room while someone conducted what could only be described as surveillance of our home. The engine was still running in the driveway. That detail bothered me more than I could explain. It suggested Marcus was planning to leave quickly, which meant he knew what he was doing was wrong. This wasn't some innocent visit or misunderstanding. "What if he tries the back door?" Emma asked. Paul was already moving toward the kitchen, gesturing for us to follow. We crept through our own house like burglars, staying low and avoiding the windows. It felt ridiculous and terrifying at the same time. From the kitchen, we could hear the footsteps more clearly as they approached the patio. Paul positioned himself near the sliding door, checking to make sure it was locked. The deadbolt was engaged, but the door suddenly seemed flimsy and inadequate. Through a gap in the curtains, I caught a glimpse of a figure moving past the window. My breath caught in my throat. Seeing Marcus there, on my property, uninvited and unwelcome, made everything feel violently real. "Did you see him?" Rachel whispered. I nodded, not trusting my voice. The man I'd shared dozens of car rides with, who'd helped me carry groceries and made small talk about the weather, was now prowling around my house in the dark. The disconnect between those two versions of Marcus made my head spin. Emma was pulling out her phone, and I saw her hands shaking as she tried to unlock the screen. "What are you doing?" I whispered. "Taking pictures. If he's going to stalk us, we're going to document it." Paul nodded approvingly. It was smart thinking, though I wasn't sure Emma would be able to get clear photos in the dark without using the flash, which would definitely alert Marcus to our location. The footsteps had stopped near the patio door. We waited, barely breathing, wondering if Marcus was testing the handle or just standing there, looking in. The silence stretched on, punctuated only by the distant sound of the idling car. Then we heard something that made my blood run cold. Marcus was talking, his voice muffled by the glass but clearly audible. "I know you're in there," he said, his tone conversational, almost friendly. "I just want to talk." Emma's eyes went wide, and Rachel grabbed onto the kitchen counter for support. The casual way he spoke was somehow more frightening than if he'd been shouting or making threats. "You don't have to hide from me," Marcus continued. "We're friends, aren't we? I've been taking care of you for months." Taking care of me. The phrase made my skin crawl. In Marcus's mind, his stalking behavior was somehow protective or caring. That level of delusion suggested this situation was far worse than we'd imagined. Paul was already reaching for his phone, but Marcus's voice came again before he could dial. "I brought you something," Marcus said. "A present. I think you'll like it." The word present hung in the air like a threat. I felt Emma grab my arm, her fingernails digging into my skin. The casual way Marcus spoke about bringing me a gift while standing uninvited on my property sent waves of nausea through me. Paul had his phone out now, thumb hovering over the emergency call button. But before he could dial, we heard the sound of something being set down on the patio table outside. A soft thunk, followed by the scrape of an object being positioned just so. "There," Marcus said, his voice still conversational. "Right where you can see it when you come out." Rachel was pressed against the kitchen wall, her face pale in the dim light filtering through the curtains. She looked like she was fighting the urge to be sick. I realized this was probably the first time she'd encountered anything like this, and seeing her older sister being stalked was forcing her to confront dangers she'd never had to consider. "I should have listened to you," I whispered to her. "About the rides, about being too trusting." "You were trying to protect me." Rachel shook her head. "This isn't your fault. You couldn't have known." But I could see the fear in her eyes, and something else. A kind of protective anger that reminded me of when we were kids, and she'd gotten furious at anyone who picked on me at school, even though she was 3 years younger. The footsteps started moving again, this time heading toward the front of the house. Paul motioned for us to stay put while he crept toward the living room to track Marcus's movement. Emma was still trying to get photos through the curtain gap, though I doubted she was capturing anything useful in the darkness. "He's checking the windows," Paul whispered when he returned. "Going around the whole house." The systematic way Marcus was surveying our home made it clear this wasn't a spontaneous visit. He was methodical, thorough. How many times had he done this before when we weren't home to notice? "What if he has a key?" Emma asked suddenly. "What if he's been inside before?" The thought hadn't occurred to me, but now it seemed terrifyingly possible. Marcus had been my driver for months. He'd waited outside while I ran errands, knew my schedule, had probably observed which doors I used and where I kept things. The idea that he might have found a way inside our house while we were gone made my legs feel weak. "We need to call for help," Rachel said, but her voice was shaking. "This is beyond what we can handle ourselves." Paul nodded, but before he could make the call, Marcus's voice came from the front of the house now, near the living room windows. "I know this is confusing," he said, and I could hear him moving closer to the glass. "But I've been watching out for you, making sure you get home safe, making sure you're okay." Emma made a disgusted sound. "He thinks he's protecting you." "All those late nights when you worked overtime," Marcus continued. "I made sure you got home. Even when you didn't call for a ride, I was there, in the neighborhood, just in case." My mind raced back through the past few months, trying to remember if I'd ever glimpsed his car on nights when I hadn't used the rideshare app. Had he been parked on our street while we slept? The violation of privacy felt overwhelming. Rachel was crying now, quiet tears that she wiped away with the back of her hand. "I hate that this is happening to you," she whispered. "I hate that someone made you feel unsafe in your own home." The footsteps had stopped again. We waited in the kitchen, 4 people huddled together in our own house, afraid to move or speak too loudly. The absurdity of the situation would have been almost funny if it weren't so terrifying. Then we heard Marcus's voice again, but this time it was different. Closer, like he was speaking directly to the kitchen window above the sink. "I saw the lights go out," he said, "but I know you're awake. I know you're listening." The blood drained from my face as Marcus's voice came through the kitchen window, so close I could almost feel his breath on the glass. Paul immediately grabbed my arm and pulled me away from the sink area, pressing his finger to his lips. "He's right outside the kitchen," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "How did he move so quietly?" Rachel had stopped crying, but I could see her hands trembling as she clutched her phone. "Should I call now?" she mouthed silently. Paul shook his head and pointed toward the hallway, indicating we should move further into the house. But as we started to creep away from the kitchen, Marcus spoke again. "I know this seems strange, but I've been keeping you safe for months. Do you remember that night in October when you worked late at the office? You walked to your car alone in that dark parking garage. I was there, watching from the street level, making sure no one followed you. I did remember that night. I'd felt uneasy walking to my car, like someone was watching me. I'd assumed it was just my imagination, but apparently Marcus had been there all along." "That's not protection," Emma whispered angrily. "That's stalking." "You don't understand," Marcus continued, his voice moving along the side of the house again. "There are dangerous people out there. People who might hurt someone like you. Someone trusting. Someone who gets into cars with strangers every day." The irony of his words wasn't lost on any of us. Paul's jaw was clenched so tightly I could see the muscles working in his cheek. "I need to get him away from the house," I whispered. "If I talk to him, maybe he'll leave and you can call for help." "Absolutely not," Rachel said, grabbing my wrist. "You're not going out there with him." "I'm not suggesting I go outside, but if I talk to him through the window, maybe I can convince him to leave. He thinks he's helping me. Maybe I can use that." Paul looked skeptical. "And what if talking to him makes him more agitated? What if he decides to break a window?" Emma was peering around the corner toward the kitchen. "He's moved to the back door now. He's trying the handle." My heart stopped. I'd been so focused on making sure the front door was locked that I couldn't remember if we'd checked the back door. Paul must have had the same thought because he immediately headed toward the kitchen. "The deadbolt's engaged," he reported quietly when he returned. "But he's definitely testing it." "This is insane," Rachel said, running her hands through her hair. "We're trapped in our own house by someone who thinks he's protecting us." Marcus's voice came from the back door now, slightly muffled but still clear. "I know you're scared, but you don't need to be scared of me. I'm the one who's been keeping you safe. Remember last month when you dropped your wallet getting out of my car? I could have kept it, but I made sure you got it back." I did remember that. He'd knocked on my window just as I was walking toward my building, holding my wallet with a concerned expression. At the time, I'd thought he was being incredibly honest and helpful. Now I realized he'd probably taken it on purpose just to have an excuse to interact with me again. "He's been manufacturing these situations," I said quietly to the others. "Creating problems so he could solve them and look like the hero." Emma nodded grimly. "Classic manipulation. Make you feel dependent on him, grateful to him." "But why?" Rachel asked. "What does he want from you?" Before I could answer, we heard the sound of Marcus moving again, his footsteps crunching on the dead leaves in our backyard. Then his voice came from a different direction entirely. "I've been thinking about this for a long time," he said, and now he sounded like he was near the side of the house, maybe by the dining room windows. "About how to tell you how I feel. About how to make you understand that we have a connection." Paul's face went pale. "He thinks you two have a relationship. I saw how you smiled at me in the rearview mirror," Marcus continued. "How you always said thank you when other passengers just got out without a word. You're different. Special. And I knew I had to protect that." The way he was talking about me, like I was some kind of precious object he'd discovered, made my skin crawl. Emma looked like she might be sick. "This is escalating," Rachel whispered. "He's not just talking about watching you anymore. He's talking about feelings, about a connection that doesn't exist." I knew she was right. Marcus had moved from justifying his stalking as protection to openly talking about romantic feelings, and he was circling our house like a predator, testing every possible entry point. Then we heard something that made us all freeze, the distinct sound of metal scraping against wood, coming from the front of the house. The metallic scraping sound sent ice through my veins. We all turned toward the front of the house, straining to hear what Marcus was doing. "That's the front door," Paul whispered, his face going ashen. "He's trying to pick the lock." Emma grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in. "We need to call the police right now. This has gone way past stalking." But even as she said it, we heard Marcus's voice again, now clearly coming from right outside our front door. "I know this seems scary, but I promise I just want to talk. Face to face. No more hiding, no more pretending we don't have this connection." The scraping sound continued, methodical and determined. Rachel pressed her back against the kitchen wall, her eyes wide. "He's actually trying to break in. This is really happening." "I've been patient," Marcus continued, his voice taking on a frustrated edge that made my blood run cold. "I've been respectful. I've waited for you to realize what we have together. But you keep running away from me, and I can't let you do that anymore." Paul moved toward the kitchen window, carefully peering around the edge of the curtain. "I can see him," he breathed. "He's got some kind of tool. Looks like he's actually making progress on the lock." The reality hit me like a physical blow. Marcus wasn't just talking anymore, wasn't just circling the house making threats. He was actively trying to get inside, and he seemed to genuinely believe that once he could talk to me face to face, he could make me understand his twisted version of our relationship. "He thinks I want this," I said, my voice barely audible. "All those times I was polite, all those thank yous and smiles, he's built this entire fantasy around normal human courtesy." Emma's hand found mine, squeezing tight. "This isn't your fault. You were just being a decent person." "But he doesn't see it that way," Rachel said, her voice shaking. "He thinks you've been sending him signals this whole time." The scraping stopped suddenly, and we heard Marcus make a small sound of satisfaction. Then came the unmistakable sound of our front door handle turning. "Oh, God," Paul said, backing away from the window. He got it open. We heard the front door creak as it swung inward, and Marcus's voice became clearer, no longer muffled by walls and distance. "I'm not going to hurt anyone," he called out, his tone almost conversational. "I just want to talk to Sarah. We need to have an honest conversation about what's been happening between us." My legs felt like they might give out. He was inside our house, talking like this was a normal social visit, like he'd been invited. Emma kept hold of my hand, anchoring me, while Rachel pressed closer to us both. "We're going upstairs," Paul whispered urgently. "Right now. There's a lock on the bedroom door, and we can call for help from there." But as we started to move toward the back stairs, we heard Marcus's footsteps in our hallway, slow and deliberate, like he was taking his time to look around. "I know you're here, Sarah," he said, and there was something almost tender in his voice that made it even more terrifying. "I can feel that you're close. We don't need to keep playing this game of hide and seek." Emma tugged on my hand, trying to get me moving toward the stairs, but I found myself frozen, listening to this man who had invaded our home talk about me like I was his girlfriend, who was simply being shy. Then we heard him moving deeper into the house, his footsteps heading toward the kitchen where we stood huddled together in the dark. The footsteps grew closer, and I could hear Marcus humming softly to himself, a tune I didn't recognize. The casual nature of it made my skin crawl. He was treating this like he was coming home after a long day, not breaking into someone's house. Paul grabbed my other arm, trying to pull me toward the back stairs, but my feet wouldn't move. The kitchen suddenly felt like a trap, with Marcus approaching from the front hallway and our only escape route requiring us to cross an open space where he might see us. "Sarah, I brought you something," Marcus called out, his voice getting closer. "Remember that coffee shop you mentioned liking? The one on 5th Street? I got you their special blend. I thought we could make some together and really talk." Emma's grip on my hand tightened so hard it hurt, but the pain helped ground me. He had been listening to every casual comment I'd made during those rides, cataloging details about my life like he was building a file on me. The coffee shop comment must have been from months ago, something I'd mentioned in passing while making polite conversation. Rachel pressed herself against the kitchen counter, her breathing shallow and quick. In the dim light filtering through the window, I could see tears streaming down her face. She looked younger than her 23 years, scared in a way that reminded me of when she was little and would climb into my bed during thunderstorms. "We have to move," Paul whispered, barely audible. "Right now, while he's still in the front part of the house." But as he spoke, we heard Marcus's footsteps change direction, moving away from the kitchen and toward the living room. "I know this is overwhelming," he said, his voice carrying through the house. "Change is always scary at first, but once you really think about it, you'll realize this makes perfect sense. We've been building toward this for months." The casual certainty in his voice was somehow worse than if he'd been screaming threats. He genuinely believed that I had been participating in some kind of courtship ritual, that my politeness and tips had been romantic encouragement rather than basic human decency. Emma tugged on my hand again, and this time my feet obeyed. We crept toward the back stairs, Paul leading the way and Rachel close behind us. Every creak of the old wooden floors sounded impossibly loud in the silence, and I held my breath each time, waiting for Marcus to hear us and come running. We made it to the bottom of the stairs when we heard him call out again, closer this time. "I know you're probably with those roommates of yours. That's okay. They can hear this too. They should understand what's happening between us." Paul was already halfway up the stairs, moving as quickly as he could while staying quiet. Rachel followed, her hand trailing along the banister for guidance in the dark. Emma and I brought up the rear, and I could feel her trembling beside me. When we reached the top of the stairs, Paul immediately led us to his bedroom at the back of the house. It was the only room with a lock that actually worked, something we'd always joked about since the rest of the house was so old that most of the original hardware had long since broken. Paul closed the door behind us and turned the lock with a soft click that sounded like salvation. The room was small and cramped with all four of us in it, but it felt safer than anywhere else in the house. Paul grabbed his phone from the nightstand, his hands shaking as he started to dial. "I can hear you moving around up there," Marcus called from downstairs, and his voice had changed slightly. There was still that unsettling tenderness, but underneath it now was something harder. "Come on, Sarah. This is silly. I'm not going away, and we both know you don't really want me to." Rachel sank onto Paul's bed, covering her face with her hands. "How long has this been going on?" she whispered. "How did we not know?" The question hit me like a physical blow because I realized I had known on some level. There had been signs, moments when something felt off, but I'd dismiss them or rationalize them away. The way Marcus always seemed to know exactly when I needed a ride, even when I hadn't scheduled one in advance. The routes he took that went past places I'd mentioned liking. The conversations that felt just a little too personal, too invested. I think part of me did know, I admitted, my voice cracking. But it seemed so impossible. I mean, I was just being normal, polite. I never thought someone would interpret basic courtesy as romantic interest. Emma sat down next to Rachel and put an arm around her shoulders. None of this is your fault, she said firmly. You can't live your life assuming that every interaction might be misinterpreted by someone with problems. Paul finished his call and looked at us with a mixture of relief and continued worry. They're on their way, but it might be a few minutes. We just need to stay quiet and wait. But Marcus wasn't content to wait. We heard his footsteps on the main staircase now, slow and deliberate. I know you're scared, he said, his voice carrying up to us. But fear is just uncertainty, and once we talk, you won't be uncertain anymore. You'll understand that this is what's supposed to happen. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs, and we heard him trying door handles. The bathroom door opened with a creak, then the linen closet. He was methodically checking each room, getting closer to where we were hiding. Sarah, he said, and now he was right outside Paul's door. I can smell your perfume, that vanilla one you always wear. I bought some for my apartment so I could think about you when you weren't around. The door handle turned, but the lock held. Marcus made a small sound of frustration, then tried again, rattling the handle more forcefully. Why are you making this so difficult? He asked, and for the first time, there was real irritation in his voice. I've been patient, I've been understanding, but this game has gone on long enough.